Hi. Like I said on Teams, I'm just going to make a recording of going over the size and content. If there is anything that you are particularly stuck on or don't understand, the best thing to do and the most obvious thing to do is to message me on Teams. So, I think we started this before synoptics, but I'll just go through it again. So, we're focusing on the differences in superpowers and how they're dealing with climate. And I'm fairly sure we looked at this map, showing the annual CO2 emissions in total amounts of CO2, and it should be pretty clear who the main culprits are in terms of CO2 emissions in 2024. So, if we're describing the global distribution, then the highest CO2 emissions in China with 12.29 billion tons. Next comes the US with only 4.9 billion, and then India with 3.9 billion. Now, if you wanted to round those numbers, so China is 12 billion, US is 5 billion, India is 4 billion. I think that would be a sensible thing to do, helps you remember it better. And there is quite a clear global north south divide on this, so high income countries, industrialized emerging economies emitting more, which makes sense because as you're manufacturing, as you've got more industrial activity, you are going to produce more CO2 because you are burning fossil fuels to power your industry. And out of the BRICS, certainly is, all BRICS are contributing to this, but it's those emerging powers, hotspots being Brazil, Russia, India, as big emitters too. So, is there a relationship between emissions and superpower status? It appears to be so. So, a direct correlation between superpower status and emission levels, as well as nations perhaps with the largest global reach. So, what do I mean by that? Nations that are perhaps trading with everyone, those nations that are perhaps very interconnected and globalized. So, the USA, let's not forget the fact that they have the biggest military in the world, right? 750 military bases in 80 countries. Along with that comes the reach of TNCs and culture. China, incredibly important country for international manufacturing and trading as well. So also these CO2 can be linked back to those industrial processes. So essentially what I want you to do, because I didn't explain this, the bold italic stuff are sort of my suggested answers. If you want to make a note of them, you can pause the video at any time. Pretty self-explanatory. So, why do superpowers contribute disproportionately to global warming and how? So, you have this one sentence in your booklet, I think, and the only thing I wanted to add next to it was this little sentence here. So, going back to our carbon stuff, because again, superpowers can be part of that synoptic paper. So you can see how a lot of superpowers, the environment and carbon is linked together. It is leading to global climate change. Now, what I've highlighted with this, so most growth has come from rapid rates of industrialization and urbanization, and that is requiring lots of energy and raw materials to fuel and sustain that growth. Rare earth minerals, which we'll get into more detail, these are becoming extremely important and essential for our green technologies, for want of a better term. So things like renewables, batteries for electric vehicles, your mobile phone, for instance. Okay. Now, another term that you might hear for rare earth minerals, sometimes they're called rare earth elements, or they might be called critical minerals. Why are they called critical minerals? Because they're extremely important for our current way of life and for our future way of life. So, in an emerging multipolar world where we are seeing the rise of BRICS, especially China, with a variety of global and regional superpowers, the demand for these materials is increasing. And so, what we need to think about is what is the impact on the environment. Now, In the case of critical minerals, you could just add this in the space underneath in your booklet. In the case of critical minerals, it is a lottery. They are unevenly distributed like other finite resources such as oil, gas, etc., all these fossil fuels and other minerals. China is definitely winning, and these are some facts that we will come back to later on, but it might be good to write them at the top of your page now so that they are ingrained in your head. China produces 60 to 70% of the global share, all right, in 2024. But perhaps I think more important is the fact that they have full monopoly. They have total control, pretty much, of the processing. So even if you are mining critical minerals in your country, so in the UK, there's a lot of interest in the southwest to do with Cornwall and lithium mining for electric batteries, whatever. You're still going to send it over to China to refine it and actually use it. Okay. So China is an incredibly important global player in rare earth metals, which might suggest that in the future, they might become more than just a regional superpower, unless other countries start to develop this technology to process and refine them, that can rival China. So China still pretty much controls the global processing part of this industry. So the share of who has the materials, China's decreasing. They are certainly fundamentally an important player in terms of processing it for now. So we have this graph, and I think we started on this. This is a stacked bar chart, and it's showing on the x-axis time and on the y-axis kilograms, and it's to do with meat consumption. And it's something that we've spoken about before, about this idea of as countries industrialize, as countries economically develop, you are going to see that growth of the middle class. And with that growth of the middle class comes that demand for more luxurious goods. So my favorite thing to talk about could be white goods, washing machines. Spent a lot of time in Carbon talking about that. But another big signifier of wealth is increase in meat. So the more meat, or the more often you eat meat, can be a signifier of how well you are doing, how well off you are. So we have this graph here, and we have done some of this stuff in Carbon and Water about the environmental impacts of meat linked with deforestation. But I just had a thing. You can pause the video. What environmental impacts do you think this has had on the country and the world? So this country is being China. So if you've not paused it, whatever. This is what I thought. However, you should be at this point of thinking for yourselves. Definitely increase change in land use to meet increase in demand. So that's quite a generic statement. So what do we mean by that? The idea that we need more space to farm meat, basically. If you want to have more cattle ranches or pork farms or whatever, you will need space to clear that. Okay. And you're not going to demolish urban environments for this. You're going to change rural areas to meet this increase in demand. So that is going to lead to an increase in deforestation. And you can get into how this is going to impact perhaps global scale issues, right? So if you've got an increase in deforestation driven from meat, it might not just be in China, you might have deforestation in places like Brazil, right? You are going to see that decrease in CO2 drawdown from the atmosphere. So you're going to have less photosynthesis, which is going to reduce the amount of CO2 being sequestered from the atmosphere, as well as perhaps an increase in CO2 if slash and burn techniques are used to clear the land. So that's really important to understand and appreciate. Quite a few students will often confuse the idea that if you cut down trees, it releases carbon. Not quite. You have to be quite specific about how the carbon is being released. Okay, so the slash and burn technique, write that. That will make it sound like you actually know what you're talking about. Okay, but certainly if there's less trees, there's less sequestration. Pretty simple one. Now in my booklet, and if you're looking at a scanned copy of it, you'll understand. I've made a little table underneath for impacts in country and impacts on the world. Okay, but see how much you can fit in. All right. Now, some of this stuff we would have done in globalization. So, if you look back in globalization EQ2, there's a section to do with what is happening and what the impacts of migration and urbanization in China and India. So, we're thinking about China, obviously. So in China, what's going to happen? Well, increased air pollution from rapid mechanization of agriculture. So this industrialization of agriculture, right? So use of machinery to produce meat. As well as another big one, perhaps more important, is going to be increased water scarcity. So we spoke about this when we did water, but the amount of embedded water, so that virtual water, how much water it is to actually make the thing, make the good, is pretty big for me, right? I think, I can't remember, I'll probably get this wrong, but 125 litres for a hamburger or something. You are going to need a lot more water to have more meat, to meet that demand. Now, the problem in China is that already 80% of groundwater is unfit due to pollution from industry and agriculture. So not only do we not have enough water to begin with, but this is definitely going to drive that water scarcity. Okay. Now, I know that we're still doing superpowers, but you can hopefully appreciate that a lot of stuff that we're talking about has crossed over between globalization and water and carbon, these core topics that could come up on a paper free. Okay. So this is why it's so important to have that sort of well-rounded revision, right? So we're not doing a sermon, right? Let's move on to impacts on the world. So these are sort of, country level, local, regional, perhaps, right, small scale impacts. These impacts on the world, we're obviously going to talk about global impacts. So if you're assessing anything, assess the impacts. An easy way to assess how the significance of an impact is by thinking about scale. Okay, so the first one is going to be a disproportionate amount of global warming. So China currently emits over 40% of global greenhouse gases. China's increased demand for meat has led to deforestation around the world. So going back to what I said about how we are seeing more deforestation in Brazil, places like that, and Southeast Asia to fuel this demand for meat. And another one from carbon would be perhaps ocean acidification. So we know from our carbon studies, EQ3, that higher CO2 levels is going to lead to more CO2 absorbed by the oceans. That could lead to ocean acidification, right? So that can destroy marine habitats and that can destroy people's ways of life. So we've gone from just looking at China's demanding more meat or consuming more meat. Well, what the local and global impacts of that, they're pretty severe. And it's, most of it is just due to those numbers. Okay? Because going back to that graph for a second, they're per capita. Okay? So a per capita amount per person. So this next slide is looking at a line graph of the use of coal. So how have China been contributing disproportionately, or what is the reason why China's been contributing disproportionately to global warming? This graph speaks volumes for itself. It is just they're burning coal. So they fueled a lot of this economic growth. You can see how from 2000 onwards, there's that significant increase, that jump, right, in use of coal. And why? Because it's so cheap. Coal is an extremely cheap fossil fuel. So the consequence of this one, again, shouldn't be a surprise, but global climate change, and that should be a pretty easy one to explain due to increased CO2 output using your carbon knowledge. On a local scale, though, public health crisis. So you're going to get an increase in respiratory disease, so things to do with lung cancer, cardiovascular disease, or CVD, if you want to shorten that down among China's urban population. And I've not written this on, but you could find some space above the graph and draw an arrow. Estimated to cause 700,000 to 2.2 million premature deaths. So this rise of or the consumption of coal to fuel this economic growth is estimated to, kill a lot of people prematurely. It's also going to feed into the food and water insecurity. So when you have CO2 or increased CO2 in the atmosphere, we know that it reacts with water to form that carbonic acid to produce acid rain. Acid rain will fall, and it makes your soil conditions a bit trickier to grow crops, and it can damage crops as well. And so it's estimated that this could reduce global food production by 12% by 2050. Okay, so this food and water insecurity could lead to an agricultural famine. So bringing in some water knowledge there. Now, this is a mixture of global and local. Another thing to think about with this acid rain is that we have something called a transboundary acid rain. So water, like carbon, like climate, it doesn't recognize international borders. Water is going to move where it wants. Okay. And so it's been found that you have some transboundary, so a cross-border acid rain due to increased sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides. That should be a capital O in the NOx. It's really annoyed me that it's done that, but I can't be bothered fixing it. And this is affecting Japan and South Korea. So on a regional scale, the acid rain is becoming a bit of a problem. But what are you going to do about it? Very little. This is a colour path map of global concentrations of air pollutants, and the World Health Organization has made this. And what's interesting is that even if we compare it to the map before of CO2 emissions, whatever it is, ages ago, there we go. On the CO2 emissions map, right, you can see that China, BRICS, right, you have that extremely high amount of CO2. But then we go onto the air pollutant side, and actually, it's still China and India, but a lot of Northern Africa is being affected by this as well, which is quite interesting. But we're going to focus on China throughout this. Now, one thing that you need to sort of untangle in your brains is this idea that, CO2 is a big air pollutant. Now, we breathe CO2 in and out, okay? Yes, we have the CO2 alarms in our rooms because if it gets too high, then that becomes an issue. But just because we are exposed to CO2 doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to die, okay? Because we breathe it in and out all the time. Air pollutants in this is going to be those sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxide stuff, those nasty chemicals that come from manufacturing. Another one might be carbon monoxide, okay, as well as something that we'll get into called particulate matter, so PM10, PM2.5. These are like micrometer scale dust particles, okay. So what did I highlight? I highlighted stuff like this. So 9 out of 10 people on the planet breathe polluted air. So you will breathe polluted air in Rochdale, okay. So this is everywhere, right? It's not just for developing nations. So 92% of global population live in places where air pollution exceeds World Health Organization limits. And Southeast Asia and Western Pacific regions account for nearly 2 of every 3 such deaths. So whilst we do have that global spread of air pollution, what's interesting in this is US is pretty clean. So if you don't, and Canada. But that might change in the future. Anyways, this problem of air pollution is getting worse in lower income countries and developing countries. So I would add to this in your notes, I would write in that there's an inequality in who produces this pollution and who is affected. And to be honest, you can expand that to global warming and climate change itself. This is the big story about this. This is the headline, really. There is that global inequality between countries that have gained from developing and polluted and those that are paying the price for it. So around 3 million deaths every year owing to outdoor air pollution. Okay. And then you have this difference here that is talking about indoor air pollution. And then the thing that I was going on about before, air quality models. If you were to Google something called air quality index, that will get you a nice website that shows you this map in live time. So the air quality changes over time. And typically what you might measure is, the most serious one is that PM 2.5. So those are sizes of 2.5 micrometers across, and they can enter the bloodstream and reach the brain. So not very nice things to be having all around. Now, you have this question here. You could use the map. So if you want to pause the video here, I will warn you now that I've written sort of I've used up all the space beneath that and above the cement contributes 8% thing, as well as drifting off into a little bit above. So if you're unsure, check the scanned version, but I'll give you a minute or so. Just pause the video. Which superpowers and emerging powers are disproportionately contributing towards degradation of air quality from that map? So, comes no surprise, China is definitely up there. Why is that? Just to remind ourselves of the why. So they've got that large reliance on coal to support manufacturing. And I think a really good answer is going to refer to, well, why do we have this manufacturing in the first place? Due to global shift. So use some of that globalization knowledge. Show that, I have learned stuff on my geography at A-level course. It's not just been Jim shouting at me. India, rapidly industrializing, especially New Delhi. So New Delhi often scores the worst in terms of global ranks, especially throughout November and December. I can't remember if we did this with you guys in year 12. We've certainly done it with the current year 12s, but yeah, don't visit New Delhi between November and December because the air quality is shockingly bad. And then another aspect of this is the USA and the EU and developed world. So one side of it is we've historically industrialized. So the UK famously is the first country to industrialize. So the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, hurrah huzzah. But the current day problem is that we import a lot of goods from India and China. So developed nations rely heavily on developing nations, China and India, right, these emerging economies, to make this stuff. So a lot of critics will call this sort of outsourcing of pollution. So whilst the UK, the USA, we're not directly emitting the pollution, we are certainly a huge contributing factor to why they are polluting so much in those countries because of that increase in emissions, right? So we've basically moved our factories from the UK, for instance, or the USA, to China to benefit from lower labour costs, lower operating costs, and all that stuff. A consequence of that is, well, we've moved where we make stuff, we've also moved the pollution, okay? So I've written this stuff at the top or just above that italicized, which superpowers and emerging powers bit. It's always good to go that extra mile and think, well, why is this? So rapid industrialization, urbanization, the energy mix stuff. So China and India depend on cheap coal to fuel development, as well as global shift. So the outsourcing of air pollution and industry. Again, we are using elements of the course there. So the industrialization, urbanization, and global shift that's coming from globalization, and then energy mix stuff from carbon too. Another thing that we can link to perhaps global warming and climate change is the use of perhaps concrete and cement. So those of you who don't really know, why should you? When you use concrete, when it sets, when it goes from like a liquid to a solid, it emits CO2. So if you ever watch Grand Designs, Kevin McCloud gets very upset about people who use a lot of concrete because it's not very nice for the environment. So cement contributes about 8% of anthropogenic, so human carbon emissions. And it's no surprise that China is definitely leading the way because they are investing hugely into infrastructure projects. Some critics say, that's why their GDP growth figures are so high, is because They are just spending lots of money on developing, so it looks good. Anyways, and they are consuming a huge amount. So we've got a bar chart there, nice simple graph. And the question is, how might this chart change in the future? Consider short term and long term. So we're using time as a lens to assess this. So straight away, those two countries there, China and India, right? So out of those two, what might happen? Well, India, might grow significantly as India catches up and undergoes rapid industrialization. Okay. And on top of this, you have some other emerging economies there. So Turkey, Iran, Brazil, Indonesia. These may increase in future as global middle class increases. Maybe not so much in Iran with USA intervention there, but who knows? What's going to happen to China? Well, there's going to be a limit to how much you can develop, right? So a lot of people think that China's going to decrease over time as this infrastructure boom potentially stabilizes. So once you're developed, so it's a bit like in the UK, you'll see, if you go to Manchester, you'll see a lot of buildings going up, but it's already pretty urbanized. So once you're urbanized, there's not much else to do. But certainly other emerging powers may increase in production to meet their own development goals. However, I don't think so on the same scale as China. You can Google this, but you can look at maps that show China's logistics or transport network grow over time and the amount of highways and trains they're building. I don't think other countries can replicate that. Okay, this stuff here is what I highlighted in this chunk of text on page 30. You can choose to highlight other things. There is one thing, though, that I want to draw your attention to, so you can read it for yourself. So pause it, read your own text, whatever. But there is something that I want to go back to, and it is that idea of if you see in the middle, next to the 60 to 70% of supply, I've put an asterisk there. This is hugely important. So rare earth minerals, it talks about what they're used for, who's dominating them. I would write this at the top. Okay, so China dominates 60 to 70% global extraction, 90% processing, 94% of manufacturing of permanent magnets. Now, why is that important? Well, we use magnets, these permanent magnets, for electric vehicles, right? These dynamos to produce electricity, as well as wind turbines. So China's basically a global monopoly in this. That gives them an incredible amount of power, right? Because you've got countries around the world scrambling to decarbonize their economies. The UK thinks it's a big player in this. It's really not. We might invent technology, but we certainly don't produce it, right? And I think that's the key distinction. UK is quite good at inventing the research side of things, but who we're going to turn to actually make the stuff is going to be China. So make sure you've written that in. This is what I've highlighted, and there are some questions below that sort of summarize this stuff. You can pause it here, you can do it yourself, or these are this is what I've put. So REMs, rare earth minerals, they're a group of 70 minerals, neodymium, lanthanum, for instance, and essentially they've got special properties that make them essential for modern tech. They're used for smartphones, laptops, electric vehicles, renewables, batteries, military technology. Yeah, so much stuff, okay? Maybe even washing machines. They're that important. Where is the majority located? China, right? So you've got the map there, but I've also told you. Their environmental impact, now this is very where people who think they're driving an electric vehicle, they're thinking environmental crusader. You are certainly wrong. Mining is quite a dirty industry, and yeah, it is going to be necessary to increase mining in the future to get these metals, but there is certainly a huge environmental impact in doing that. So, whilst you might reduce the amount of CO2 being released because you're not burning petrol, right? You're certainly going to wreck the environment in another way. So, we need to clear land. So, to mine, you can't just, mine with the trees in the way, you just chop them all down. That has impacts on CO2 and carbon cycling. Another thing is the chemicals to process and refine them. So, without going into too much detail, these rare earth minerals, they're not coming out as, a usable state. You'll have to process them. There'll be oxides or whatever. And so to separate them out, you need to process them. I don't know the full ins and outs of it, but I guarantee that the environmental impacts on it, or perhaps there's a bit of a relaxed attitude towards dealing with those waste chemicals once you've used them, right, in China. Mining uses lots of water, so if you've got a mine that's deep underground, you will need to pump out that water and put it somewhere, but you'll also need to use lots of water to refine, and that is adding to that water insecurity, which, as we've already discussed, is a growing concern because of increase in meat. So, in the context of superpowers, why does this matter? Rare earth minerals are going to be critical, hence why they're called critical minerals, but they're going to be critical for our future way of life. If we're going to decarbonize our economy, China controls it, right? So China has control over these rare earth minerals. That increases dependence. So the UK, the US, right? We are dependent on China because they control the production and refining of them for current tech in the future. Okay. So that gives China a large amount of power. Okay. It's why perhaps the UK is trying to improve those relations with China, with the embassy, the stuff that's going on at the minute. Yeah, so there you go. Now, this might change in the future, but China's probably benefiting from economies of scale to do with rare earth minerals and manufacturing. They are world leaders in that side of things. So, if I remember, it's not perhaps Chinese-owned companies that refine that. It'll be these major mining TNCs that are just based there. Because if China had a lot of the supply anyway, right, it would make sense to just build your production or refining places near the mines rather than export, because you want to reduce on transport costs. Now, if you want an A or an A star, or if you want to push your grade further, there is a Beyond the Booklet article on page 31 that talks about the use of AI, right? And this is an interesting article. AI heavily relies on computing power and water and semiconductors, and there's a lot of geographies of that to do with who controls the global chip market and stuff like that. So it talks about different countries and different responses to this, but it's also talking about the environmental impacts of AI use, especially to do with water. Okay, so yeah, just another fun thing to think about. So that's 31 to 32, something to read about. Okay, so we've spoken about superpowers and environmental impacts. Linked to that is this idea of, well, what impact is the growth of middle class consumption? Okay, so what is the middle class? So the red stuff is the things that are missing, so the gaps. Okay, So the middle class refers to people with disposable income above basic needs, allowing spending on consumer goods, services, leisure, and savings. So without going too much into economics, um, you can't really save money unless you've got bits left over at the end, right? That's pretty obvious. So if you are paid £1,000 a month, right, and after rent, food, whatever bills, you don't have any money left, you can't afford to save. So middle class, nice way to think about it is you can buy nicer things, but also you can afford to save. So what's happening around the world? Now, globalization has been a success because through globalization we have, increased levels of development across the world. But as we know, when people earn more, they like to demand more because people like more stuff, which you could argue is a bit of a byproduct from American consumerism, but that's for another day. The World Bank classifies global middle class, so this is what I've housed in my booklet, as those earning roughly $10 to $50 per person per day. PPP, purchasing power parity, so that is correcting for currencies and difference in values of currencies. To be honest, £10 to £50, that's not a lot of money, but anyways. This group typically experiences rising consumption, urban lifestyles, and high ecological footprints. So you're buying more stuff that requires more resources. So think about everything that you buy in a day that has come in some sort of plastic packaging, right? That has to come from somewhere. Or everything that you've bought, right? Unless you've gone to a market, a farmer's market, where they've got extremely low food miles or whatever, has been transported. And that transport has an ecological footprint that goes along with it. So we have rapid expansion of the middle class, and this is increasing the demand for food, water, etc., which is meaning that we have more resource extraction to get the resources, and there is going to be a sort of some countries are going to extract things better than others in terms of the environmental impact. So there's an argument out there among petroleum geologists, for instance, that we should be extracting North Sea oil and gas because the UK oil and gas industry has tighter environmental regulations than other countries. But that's a debate for another day. Now, you've got this table on page 33 that talks about what pressure is going to be added from increasing or rising consumption. Essentially, just make some little summary notes. So this is what I've done, for instance, around it. So, for instance, food, that nutrient transition is going to cause a strain on sources and increase land clearance. So we've already talked about meat, for instance, and how that is going to, or that increased demand for meat is going to affect land and carbon cycling. Water, we're going to decrease supply because we've got increased demand. So not only from food, but also the increased demand of water from resources, etc., the mining stuff. We're going to increase our demand for energy. So we need to either sort out the supply side or price is going to increase. If we think back to energy security, so carbon EQ2 stuff, some countries are going to be different from others. So countries with own supplies are likely to be in a strong position than those relying on imports. And then lastly, resources. So again, increased demand. So there's sort of a common theme on this. Everything's going to be increased demand. Okay. So our increased price of consumer goods. So things are going to become more expensive. All right. So that's a sort of summary of what I've written, dotted around. Again, check the scan version, which I'll put up on Teams. There is a challenge question now, which I think is quite good. Because remember, for superpowers, you're going to be assessed. So you need to justify, you need to make a decision. Okay. Now, notice in that table, you do have examples of places and figures and facts. That's stuff that I would flashcard, I would choose to remember. Now, which of the resources will be affected the most? by a growing middle class justify your answer? So have a think. Which one do you think is going to be affected the most? I've gone for, and if you also pick this, there's not necessarily a prize in this. I just think this particular factor affects a lot of things, and without it, you will die, which is a cheery thought. It's water. Okay. We can eat other food. We can get energy from other things. We don't have to have the latest, iPad or whatever. Water, on the other hand, is essential for human life. All right? There is not a substitute. Without water, we can't really do much. And if we think about, what is driving that increased demand of water? Well, food, energy, and resources is all affecting water. Okay? So you've got, you could draw arrows linking food, energy, resources to water, and along those links explain, why is water the most, or the factor that we should be concerned about the most. And we can throw in some classic climate change in there. So again, play with the idea of futures and uncertainties. Climate change in the future is going to cause more droughts, and that is going to fuel that water insecurity. So not only have we got an increase in water demand from increased food, increased energy, increased resources, we're also going to have the supply side of water constrained, because places will experience more droughts. So if you turn over, or you can pause it here, whatever. We have, I don't know what type of graph this is. It's a bit like a pie chart, I guess, but it's split up into sectors, different pizza sizes that grow. I don't know. But it's showing two rings, so the outer ring and the inner ring. So the outer ring is in 2030, which is 4 years' time. And then the inner ring was in 2009 in trillions. Now, this is from the OECD. It's not been given a date of when it was made. So something to consider when you're looking at data. When was it made? When was it produced? We're only 4 years away from that 2030. It would be interesting to see this in more up-to-date figures. But anyway, that's maybe an independent side project. We've got 2 questions. Where are the biggest changes in middle class consumption going to occur? Now, I've done this away using percentage change, which I think is a really nice way to do it, because you could try and remember, the obvious one is Asia Pacific, which if you look at the map there, covers China, Australia, India, right? Areas where you have seen that massive increase. Percentage increase is going to be new minus old over old, which new minus old on this, so 32.9 minus 44.9 is going to be 28. If you do 28 divided by 4.9 times 100, that would give you a 571% increase. Okay, so that is a big increase. Okay. In terms of absolute terms as well, it's also had the biggest increase. So $28 trillion increase. So not only is it percentage-wise the biggest, it's also the biggest in terms of absolute. Central South America, similar calculation, 120%. The Middle East, 144%. So if you've got a 100% increase, that's effectively a double, right? Notice how North America and Europe, you don't really have as big of an increase, because a lot of people are already middle class. Now, don't come for me. I live in Rochdale. I wouldn't consider myself middle class. Remember, this is coming off the World Bank definition of what middle class is. It is the idea of you can save, okay, or you can buy nice things. And I think take a wider picture, a wider view of the world. Our middle class is probably going to be very different to, say, Central Africa's middle class, right? But I appreciate that within the UK we do have differences on what different classes mean, but that's a debate for another time. So, in terms of our global economy, then, what is the significance? You could argue this is going to shift the global economic center of gravity. So, the global shift is that definition of the economic center of gravity, right? So, what this means is it's very much Western dominated at the minute. So, North America and Europe arguably have the biggest consumer spending, right? Notice how this data is not per capita, right? So, if it was per capita, then we'd still see a similar picture of North America and Europe being the biggest middle class. However, Asia Pacific, China, India, right, Southeast Asia, they're increasing. TNCs have more markets to sell. So this growing middle class is perhaps going to fuel more consumers in the world because people have more money, they want to buy more stuff. TNCs are going to look at that and try to enter these new markets to sell their products. So it could be further globalization, which is something that we talked about in globalization, the idea that TNCs are going to change their products to meet market or specific market and cultural demands. So the McPania, I think, is a classic example of McDonald's entering India. And on top of this, changing consumption patterns. So this links nicely back to what we saw in that demand of meat. So with that increase in middle class, you typically see that increased demand for luxury goods. So meat is definitely a luxury good. Not everyone can afford it. But as well, you see the increased demand for nicer cars, right? Or electronics, things that require resources. And ultimately, globalization is winning. It's becoming more interdependent and integrated, but certainly more vulnerable to global economic shocks, as well as keep an eye out on what's happening in China and India. Because if you have this increase in consumer spending in China, that's going to fuel this global economic growth on a global scale. But then if China's economy takes a downfall or it slows down, well, they spend less, and that could have a ripple effect on the global economy. This bit is underneath. I didn't highlight any of it. It's just sort of comparing if Chinese consumer had a similar income to the EA, what would it mean? Pretty simply, they're going to use a lot of resources. Okay, so how sustainable this is, I don't know. So there's two questions. Could this demand even be met? Are there physically enough resources to supply demand? There used to be, well, some places will probably still teach it, but Malthusian belief that as population increases, it plateaus and you can't sustain it. Who knows? I don't know. You could argue that it's highly unlikely it leads to rapid depletion of resources and large-scale environmental degradation. But on the other hand, how do we know how many resources we've got? Maybe we have some shifts in society. I don't know. Right? This is very hard to predict. And then you've got this bit. Assuming the demand was met, what would the implications be for environmental issues such as global warming, deforestation, water pollution, and land degradation? Now, I've sort of written in my booklet 4 boxes, and I've drawn arrows pointing it up. So if you want to do something similar, again, if you're unsure, check the version on Teams. So for global warming, increased CO2 emissions, that's a bit of a no-brainer, and it might push past those global temperatures set by, say, a Paris Agreement. That is assuming, though, that to fuel this demand, they are going to emit more CO2. They might not, right? Maybe we see this big growth in renewables to do this job. I don't know. Deforestation. So we've spoken about how deforestation in the land currencies is linked to that demand for meat. So if you want to have more meat, you need more space to shepherd. I want to say grow meat, rear cattle. I don't know, but you need more space to have animals. But on top of that, you also need more space to grow crops to feed the animals. So soybeans, for instance. So that's going to take up your land too. Water pollution. So if you've got more agriculture, you could have dead zones in rivers and oceans. Now, what is a dead zone? So GCSE biology incoming. Assuming that we don't have organic farming in these places, you're most likely going to use fertilizers, and fertilizers aren't typically used properly, and so that could lead to increased eutrophication, which is a process whereby you've got excess nutrients going into fresh water, causes the algae bloom, that blocks that sunlight, that kills plants, that kills wildlife because water becomes deoxygenated, right? And that is really hard to fix. That takes about 40 to 50 years to fix if you've got these dead zones. This is also happening, by the way, in the UK. Eutrophication is not something that is just for developing countries. There's plenty of it going on in the UK. We're also going to see water pollution from increased mining as well. So this is a separate point. The arrows have done something weird, but again, so you're going to see more water pollution from increased mining with more heavy metal pollutants in water. Quite a few heavy metals are linked to cancer, so they are carcinogens, and then land degradation as well. So increased soil degradation and desertification. So desertification, that process of places becoming deserts, right? Drying out, the increase in aridity. So those are the sort of annotations I'd like you to put down for that. Please pause it. Make sure your booklets are filled in. Now, the last thing on page 35, and then I think I'll pause, or I'll make a new video for the next stuff, is this. So there are 2 explain questions here. Now, you will get, for Superpowers, in paper 2, usually it's an explain question, but it could be a maths question. But the explain questions are always going to be 95% of the time explain one effect. Okay, so you have to be very clear in your writing. One effect. Do not start saying another effect is, right, because at that point, what's going to happen is they'll mark both, and they'll mark however many effects you've talked about, and they'll just take your highest one. From personal experience as an examiner, when people don't do what they're told in an exam question, if you're on a bad day, it will make me annoyed. Maybe the examiner doesn't like you as much. All right, so one effect. Okay, so think of your strongest effect, run with it. Okay, so how would I do this? Well, it's a point and basically a very developed explanation. You can put in an example of a place if it fits, all right, to give you that extra point, all right. A lot of this stuff is going to be one effect of key resources in emerging superpowers. It's going to be linked to demand. There's an increased demand. Why is there an increased demand? And what effect is that having? So linking it back to environmental degradation might be a nice thing to do. So if you want to pause it here, give this a try. That's great. Another thing might be that the effect has something on prices as well. All right. But yeah, have a go. And then I'm going to put the mark scheme, which has a variety on there. So yeah. So here's the mark scheme. There's lots of things you could talk about. Essentially in this, as long as the explanation development makes sense, then that's what's happy. And that's what's going to make the examiner happy. Now that stuff about territorial control in places like Arctic, that's bringing in some EQ3 knowledge for superpowers, which we've not done yet, so don't necessarily worry about that. But certainly, growing middle class is prompting increased competition for resources such as fresh water, and that idea of poor nations and water there, oil prices. Okay, so there you go. With these, stick to one effect and run with it. You'll notice at the bottom, accept any other appropriate response. There's a lot you can get out of these questions as long as it's that chain of reason is there, right? So one effect is this, for example, this, then that, therefore, yep, happy days. There's another question. Explain one way superpower resource demands cause environmental damage. For me, this would be easy to answer. The environmental impact stuff is quite simple. Again, pause the video, have a go, and then you can check your answer. Again, the key here is to stick to one way, right? So there's the mark scheme. All right, so emerging countries such as China have low urban air quality, industrialization of coal, greenhouse gas emissions, growing global warming crisis. So, this would be a nice question to get up on an exam. It does link in nicely with a lot of the environmental impacts of carbon that we looked at in Carbon EQ3 too. So with that, I'm going to pause it there. I will make another video, I think, for page 36. Well, page 36 has a Beyond the Booklet, but certainly for 37 onwards, about role of BRIC nations, and then the differences in attitudes of China and USA. All right, so I will put up these slides. My booklet's also going to be up in there. I hope this video was useful. If you've got any questions, let me know. But then other than that, yep, part 2 coming soon to YouTube near you.